Good evening. My name is Yumi Iwasaki. I know the program says Hiroshi Matsubara, but I'm taking his place tonight since unfortunately Hiroshi could not be here today. I serve as a co-chair of Washinkai along with Naomi Minegishi. And on behalf of Washinkai, I would like to welcome you all here and online to this evening's event, What is Haiku? Washinkai is a volunteer group started in 2018 to support the classical Japanese studies at UW. This year, we established Washinkai Endowed Program Fund to support teaching and research of classical Japanese at UW. We have also been organizing public lecture series since the beginning to raise awareness and appreciation of classical Japanese literature and culture. We continued doing so online during the last 2 years, but tonight we are happy to be back in Kane Hall. We are also live streaming this event, and I'm delighted that we received as many as 435 registrations as of this morning. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Paul Atkins. Professor Atkins is a professor of Japanese in UW's Department of Asian Languages and Literature. He teaches classical Japanese language and literature and writes about literature, drama, and culture of medieval Japan. Professor Atkins has written numerous articles, books, chapters, translations, and reviews. His books include Teika, The Life and Works of a Medieval Japanese Poet, and Revealed Identity, The No Plays of Komparu Zenchiku. His current project is a translation of poems by Zekkai Chushin, a medieval Japanese Zen abbot. Professor Atkins' lecture will be followed by a roundtable discussion with 2 haiku poets from the community, Mitsuko Miller and Scott Oki, moderated by Bruce Rutledge of Origami Magazine. So now please welcome Professor Atkins.
Thank you very much. Just briefly, as would befit a talk on haiku, I'd like to express my gratitude to Washinkai, the Friends of Classical Japanese at UW, for making tonight's event possible, for providing fellowships for my graduate students, including our current Washinkai Fellow, Nobuko Horikawa, and for believing, as I do, in the importance of classical Japanese language, literature, and culture. I'm grateful to all of our generous donors and to all of our wonderful members, including Janet Heineck, Yuko Kikuchi, Kotoku Kurachi, Hiroshi Matsubara, Yoshi Minegishi, Noriko Palmer, Eugene Saburi, Stephen Sumida, Te Yoshitani, our honorary member, the Honorable Yoichiro Yamada, former Consul General of Japan in Seattle, the members of our steering committee, Ikuko Helovic, Nikki Nakamitsu, Leslie Yamada, and our co-chairs, Yumi Iwasaki and Naomi Minegishi. I thank you all from the bottom of my heart. We will be taking some questions at the end of the program today, and you have index cards and pens there. They're not there for complaints. They're there for questions about things that might come to mind. And I encourage you, as I always do when I'm speaking, to think about them as I'm speaking. If we get to the end, you won't remember what your questions are. I've had this experience many, many times. So jot some things down and we'll puzzle them out when we go. And those can be questions related to my presentation or to the remarks that you'll hear from our wonderful local poets Mitsuko Miller and Scott Oakey. So, there we go. What is haiku? That's a very easy question. In fact, I've already answered it for you in the abstract for this talk, which is printed in the program. Haiku is a very brief verse form. It's perhaps the shortest poetic form in the world. It comes from Japan. The haiku has 17 syllables, arranged in 3 phrases or lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. Just about everyone knows that much. If you know a little bit more, you are aware that a haiku must contain a kigo, or a seasonal word, a word that indicates the season, either explicitly or implicitly. So certainly autumn is, of course, a seasonal word, but we could also indicate the season that we're in right now with words like colored leaves, chestnuts, chrysanthemums, mushrooms, geese, persimmons, fresh breezes, or cold nights. And in fact, if the moon is mentioned in a haiku poem without any season specified by convention and tradition, it is considered to be the autumn moon. To go even further along the formal axis, a haiku must contain a so-called cutting word that syntactically either breaks the haiku into 2 pieces of 5 and 7, 5, or 5, 7, and 5, or breaks the entire haiku off at the end from what might come after it. And this is a requirement that's a little bit easier to explain and understand in Japanese, but I think it accounts for the high number of translations of haiku into English that can contain exclamation points and dashes and colons to indicate this. So that is fundamentally it. If you can produce a text that obeys these rules, it's technically a haiku. Some people may say, well, it's a senryu, it's not quite serious enough, but those are the technical requirements. It's probably not overly difficult to write a computer program that could do this, and now with the advent of artificial intelligence, it might even be able to produce coherent haiku. And so now that you know what a haiku is, we can all go home at 7:07, and those of you who are already at home can change the channel. I've already told you what it is. But of course, there's a lot more than the formal rules and the counting of syllables to haiku. We're really after something that is a little bit more ineffable. What might make a good haiku, or a great haiku, or what haiku poets were aiming at, or perhaps even more important, what readers of haiku are seeking from haiku. And of course, you're curious, I think, about how haiku came about, and that's what I'm here to tell you. My talk is going to be as much about what haiku was as what it is. Let me start with etymologies. If you look at these characters here, the second one is simple enough. Ku, it's a phrase or some other kind of utterance, like a poem, group of words. The first one is a little puzzling. It's a little unusual. We don't see it very often, but if you read Japanese, actually, you see it fairly frequently. There's a word called hayu, and a hayu is an actor in a play or in a film. And it originally referred hai to people who sang, or hayu, sang or danced, or they made funny gestures or movements to amuse people or to amuse the gods. They might offer their performances as offerings. So the first character, hai, indicates a kind of play or fooling around, which made it the right word for people who put on plays. Don't we say play in English? Well, what connects that to haiku? What's so playful about haiku? Sometimes it seems playful to us, but often it seems subtle, it seems profound, deep, melancholy, and even gloomy. Why is this happening? To trace the origin of the word haiku, we must go back in our time machine to poetic forms and make a quick review of poetry in classical Japanese literature. Traditional Japanese poems and songs are almost always based on lines or phrases of 5 and 7 syllables. No one knows why. In the Chinese, poems often use lines of 5 or 7 characters, but they use lines of different lengths as well, and it's hard to really draw a line between China and Japan in this instance. In fact, the Japanese poems probably existed before they had even had any real contact with China. And so unlike classical Chinese poetry, Japanese poetry never rhymes. They just count the syllables. They don't even count the stresses as we do in English. So here is something of an overview. This is a portrait of the famous poet Kakinomoto no Hitomaro. His dates are about 655 to about 710. And this was done a couple centuries later. We don't really know what he looks like, but he's always painted like this with his slouchy hat looking up. And this is a poem that he wrote. It appears in the Manyoshu. It's called a choka or long song. The Manyoshu is a collection of Japanese poetry that was completed in the mid-700s. And this is all one poem. This is long by Japanese standards, but it's definitely not long, for example, by ancient Greek standards. They begin up at the top left, Tamamoyoshi, with a 5-syllable line, followed by 7, 5, 7, 7, and that can be repeated indefinitely, ending, as you see at the end here, Machika Kouram. I can't even read it from here. In any event, it ends 7-7. And this is what it looks like in English. And you can appreciate how long it is relatively. It's a lament by the speaker. He discovered the corpse of a drowned man on what is now the island of, what was the island of Samine in its now Kagawa prefecture in Shikoku. I just wanted to show you that there are long poems in Japanese. Sometimes these choka or long poems were accompanied by a shorter poem at the end. They were called hanka. We call them in English envoys. And they would be in the metrical pattern 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. You're familiar with that if you know about modern tanka or you know waka. This is a portrait of Ono no Komachi, who was active in the middle of the 9th century. She was a famous female poet. And her works in the Kokinshu include this poem. Omoitsutsu nurebaya hito no mietsuran, yume to shiriseba samezaramashi wo. Was it because I fell asleep thinking of him that he appeared? Had I known it was a dream, I would not have awoken. I've given you the Japanese, the romanization, and the translation. All the translations I'm showing you tonight are mine, unless indicated otherwise, and none of them are indicated otherwise, I think. So this is a tanka, and it's a spin-off from the choka, and this lasts for 1,000 years. People are still writing tanka today. It was so dominant that the word waka, Japanese poetry, actually often just refers to this tanka form. Okay, hang in there, we're getting closer. From very earliest times, we have examples of what we call in English a capping verse, in which 2 people would produce a tanka. The first person would write the top half, as we say, 5, 7, 5, and the other person would reply with a 7, 7. And they tended to be spontaneous displays of wit. This is an example from a text by Ton A, great poet and monk, and he's relating the story that he'd heard from somebody who died before he was even born, a courtier, Tameuji. Tameuji is at court, and he's accompanying the emperor on a journey. And the carriage has gone out, and the emperor sees Tameuji break off a branch of sakura blossoms, cherry blossoms that had been in a vase, and take it with him. So he wants to tweak him a little bit, so he calls for somebody to challenge him with a renga, and he has one of his ladies in waiting, Ben no Naishi, who was an accomplished poet. She says to her, make up something, and she comes up with Shiranami no tachi yorite oru sakura bana. A white wave bandit approaches to break off the cherry blossoms. Shiranami, white waves, are also a slang term that meant bandits. So she's playfully accusing him of stealing these blossoms. And he has to come up, his punishment is to come up with something on the spot. And on the spot, he says, "Chirashikakete zo nigu bekari keru." When he starts scattering the blossoms, he will be able to escape. That's how he's going to make his getaway, and plays with it. And this pleases the emperor quite greatly. You can imagine how fun this was. This pastime of capping verses remained just an occasional amusement until around the middle of the 1200s, when accomplished tanka poets like Fujiwara no Teika gathered, and they created long chains of verses, not just one capping another, but one capping that one, and so on and so on and so on. It would go on for 36 links, or 50 links, or for 100 links. This form, and it was a separate art form, is called renga, or linked verse. It's the ancestor of haiku. When aristocratic poets sat down to do this, they had a lot of fun, but being aristocrats, they did it tastefully, and they did it a little bit soberly. There was serious renga, which was called ushin renga. meaningful renga, sincere renga, and there was not so serious renga called mushin renga, nonsense, or playful or silly renga. And these terms were already in existence in the mid-1200s when renga first took off. In fact, retired Emperor Gotaba organized sessions of renga, and he had both kinds of poets, the serious and the silly kind, and he made them compose together, and they competed for prizes, including cash and fine paper. Believe it or not, renga became a popular fad. In reaction to the popular fad, the Ushin movement tried to elevate renga once again to high art through the efforts of poets like the Buddhist monk Shinke and his student Sogi. Sogi appears probably the central figure in the history of renga. And the pinnacle of art, the art of renga, is this sequence called Minase Sangi. Three poets at Minase, it's Sogi and two of his disciples, Shohaku and Socho, and they got together at outside Kyoto and began to compose. This is just the very 6 verses out of 100. And you can see how they go from one verse to another. Sogi's verse is about snow lingers on the base of the hill that's misty. This is in the early spring. Shohaku extends it with flowing water that they can hear, and plum blossoms, another image of spring. And then Socho follows up with the image of willows and finally mentions the word spring. And then Sogi just talks about the time being dawn and the sound of a boat being pulled. It's not necessarily a season, but it is a definite time of day. And then Shohaku replies with the moon remaining in the foggy night. Now it's autumn because autumn is associated with the moon and fog. And then Socho has the meadow covered in frost and mentions explicitly autumn. So we've gone from spring in the 3rd verse to autumn explicitly mentioned in the 7th verse, with the 4th verse making the pivot, making the change. It's really interesting to see this. They could be as long as a choka, but the choka I showed you earlier was on one topic. This is on multiple topics. Renga is always shifting and it's always moving. It's a fascinating, fascinating art form. However, the folksy form of renga never really died out. It prized wit and it used images and phrases from our everyday life. And that kind of renga was called haikai no renga, which I would translate as playful linked verse. This term haikai was actually an old term. It appears in the Kokinshu, compiled around 905, and it was just describing comical poems. But it was used now to describe this sort of playful type of linked verse, haikai no renga. It was the reincarnation or continuation of mushin renga. It was decidedly unserious and approachable. Haikai no renga was soon shortened to the word haikai. In the time of Matsuo Basho, the most famous haiku poet of Japan, many and perhaps most of the 575 poems he composed were not independent verses, but were parts of a larger haikai session. They would get together to compose these long links together. The initial verse of those sessions was called a hoku, a start off or a kickoff verse. Basho didn't use the word haiku. He called it hoku, the initial verse of a sequence of linked verse. And this is renamed in the middle of the 19th century by the poet Masaoka Shiki. He was a poet himself. He tried to reform haikai. He felt it was stale, and he called it haiku. And it came to assume the meaning it has now. A brief poem, an independent poem of 17 syllables with a seasonal reference that could stand alone as its own and did not have to initiate an extended sequence. And to summarize the 1,000 or so years of terminology that I've covered, we went from choka to tanka to renga to haikai no renga, haikai, to the hoku, the first verse of a non-serious sequence, and finally to haiku. And that's why we call it that. Now that we know what haiku means from an etymological point of view and a literary historical point of view, and we have a general sense of where it comes from, I'd like to show you some examples from major poets and discuss their innovations and say something about the poetic ideals of haikai. The 3 major figures in the history of the haikai are Matsuo Basho, Yosa Buson, and Kobayashi Isa. And I'll begin with Matsuo Basho, the central figure. He was born in 1644 in the province of Iga, which corresponds to the western part of what is now Mie Prefecture. He studied in Kyoto. He moved to Edo, which is now Tokyo, and he used Edo as a base for his many, many travels, including his journey into northeastern Japan, which he chronicled in his famous haiku diary, Narrow Road to the Deep North, Okuno Hosomichi. Basho had many students and associates all over Japan, so sometimes when he was traveling a little bit more comfortably than you would think just by reading his travel diary. Those are works of art. He had a wide network, he knew people, they were eager to have him visit. Some of them were in a very good position to show him a very good time. Basho died on the road in Osaka at the age of 50 in 1694, and this is his death poem. Tabi ni yande yume wa kare no wo kake meguru. Ill on a journey, in my dreams I roam the withered fields. It's a sad poem, but I like it a lot because it illustrates the poet's wanderlust. And I think many of us are eager to be traveling again. At the same time, it represents the altered state of consciousness, of being ill with fever. These are half dreams, half hallucinations. I don't have a lot of time, so I'd like to, with Basho, cut to the chase. I know what you're waiting for. I know what you want, and I'm going to give it to you. This is it. Furuike ya kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto. The old pond, a frog jumps in and splash. Much ink has spilt, as they used to say, about this verse. On the surface, there's not much to it. It's a little bit like the Mona Lisa. You kind of scratch your head and you try to figure out what's the big fuss over this one. But of the things I've read about it, the most useful comment was that in earlier poetry, waka poetry, and the haiku poets don't forget it. They're writing out of they're sort of an offshoot. They're a subsidiary branch of the waka tradition. And they read their waka. Basho knew his waka quite well. But in waka poems, you don't see the frog, you hear the frog, it croaks. And they celebrated the croaking of the frog just as much as they celebrated the twittering of birds or the chirping of cicadas. This poem, however, handles the frog differently. In the first line, we're very much in the classical tradition. We've got this old overgrown pond, it's ancient, it's very serious, it's very staid. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, boom, comes this frog. It jumps in, it plops in. We have the static scene that's in a certain sense shattered by the action of the frog, this unusual handling of it. And then the splash that we recognize, we hear it, and we probably even see it in our mind's eye as the ripples cascade, go out through the water. It says the sound of water, but it's the sound of water to me sounds like running water, sounds like a stream or a river. This is a splash, and that's why I've translated it that way. As for why this poem became so famous, as I mentioned, Basho wasn't just a writer of haiku, he was a teacher of haiku, and he had lots of associates and disciples and students, and he founded a lineage or school, and members of that school would seize on this poem. It was to them it represented his satori moment, his moment of enlightenment. You have this sudden, almost like a Zen experience, where this sudden experience brings you into some broader or deeper awareness. And they felt he was almost led to literary enlightenment by this frog. You might be interested in other interpretations of this poem or where I found these interpretations. And if you are interested in historical interpretations of this poem or many others by a poem, I highly, highly, highly recommend this volume. It's fascinating. Basho and his interpreters selected hokku and commentary by Makoto Ueda. The late Professor Ueda was also an alumnus of the University of Washington. He was awarded the PhD in comparative literature 60 years ago in 1962. I had the good fortune to study modern and early modern literature with him, including haiku at Stanford, and it is thanks to that encounter that I'm able to speak to you on this topic tonight. This is a fascinating book and allows you to compare your own interpretations of Basho, various interpretations, with those of generations of readers spanning centuries. In fact, if you'd like to read more books, Professor Ueda wrote at least 6 books about haiku in English, and they're all wonderful. I recommend them to you for their clarity, their erudition, and their wisdom. Something I would like to impress upon you about tonight, when you think of takeaways and you're driving home or riding home, is in the importance of haiku is context. When we think about writing poetry, I would propose to you that we generally adopt a romantic, capital R, romantic view of it, imagining a person alone, having an experience and recollecting that experience or capturing it on the spot. And I'm not saying that's impossible. In fact, this thing called shase, or sketching from life, is a major technique in writing haiku. People would just go out and sit and listen and wait and compose on the spot. On the other hand, there are poems that are clearly prepared under circumstances that we might consider somewhat artificial. For example, for a contest, which was a very popular phenomenon in pre-modern Japan, or even for one of these linked verse sessions. Renga poets are not necessarily mentioning love in their sequence because they are in love or out of love, but because the rules of renga demanded it. Somebody might tell them the next verse has to be a love verse, or it has to be about the moon, or what have you, and it was dictated to them. But there is a third kind of poem I have in mind, and that is a poem that comes out of a particular time and place, a fixed context. Here's an example. Botan shibe fukaku wake izuru hachi no nagori kana. From deep among the stamens of the peony, the bee emerges and departs with regret. This is a lovely image. It's certainly seasonal. The peony is associated with early summer. I think many of you might have peonies in your garden, and you know how they grow this little, almost this little cage, and you have to look really deeply to get inside. And we've got this lovely image of the bee. You might notice if you're reading this, the Japanese, or even just counting the vowels in the Romanized version, which will give you a good idea of the syllable count. This is not in the 5-7-5 pattern. It's 8-8-5 or it's 5-8-8, depending on how you parse it. I'm not even sure how they would parse these poems. You would be surprised how often Basho went over the numbers and exceeded the limits. It's a bit more frequent than you might expect. But my point is about the context, because this poem didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of somewhere. It's actually from the diary of another trip that Basho took from 1684 to 1685. And he wrote this diary. It's called Nozarashi Hiko, or Travels of a Weather-Beaten Skeleton. And it appears in that diary with this head note. He was actually traveling and he stopped in Nagoya, not far from the Atsuta Shrine. And the head note says, Futatabi toyo shiga moto ni arite, imaya azuma ni kudaran tosuru ni, botan shibe fukaku wake izuru hachi no nagori kana. Once again, I was with Master Toyo, and he's identified, we know exactly who he was. His name was Hayashi Shichizayamon of Atsuta in Nagoya, when I was about to head east. So Basho stops in at Nagoya, and he's headed to the eastern country, Edo. And then he composes, from deep among the stamens of the peony, the bee emerges and departs with regret. Basho had been staying for some time. In fact, this was the second time he was staying with Mr. Hayashi and his family. And so the poem presents us not just with a lovely visual image, but through its symbolism, it functions as a gesture of thanks from a guest to his kind hosts. Basho is the humble bee, withdrawing from the alluring, encompassing warmth of the peony, his host Toyo. The context makes the poem all the more effective. And this is one way that haiku poets have overcome the tight limits of the form by embedding their short poems inside the larger context of a prose work, like a travel diary. In fact, haiku prose literature forms a genre of its own called haibun, which is a hybrid of prose and poetry. There is another merger of haiku with a different genre, and that is haiga, haiku, painting. This also gives us a chance to turn to the next poet, Yosabu Son. His dates are 1716 to 1783. He was born well after Basho died, and so they never met. But that did not prevent Buson from demanding, Basho ni kaere, return to Basho. That was his slogan. From his perspective, haiku had declined since the time of Basho. It was going back into frivolity and vulgarity. So he wanted to elevate it once more again. This ideal is called rizoku, separating from the common, departing from it. In a certain sense, he went even further than Basho in departing from the everyday. One of Basho's most famous dicta is, Takaki kokoro o satorite zoku ni kaeru beshi. Not return to Basho, that would be himself, but awaken to the elevated sensibility and then return to the commonplace. Elevate yourself, cultivate yourself, sublimate your ideas, develop this elegant sensibility, and then return to the everyday, return to the mundane, return to common life. In that way, we can sublimate the everyday, but Buson had had enough of the everyday. As you can see, Buson was a painter, and he was no slouch either. This is his work, Wild Horses, done on 2 screens. It's been said he's the only person who would appear in a list of the greatest Japanese painters of all time, and also a list of the greatest Japanese poets of all time. He was immensely talented. Perhaps because he was a painter, people tend to emphasize the visual aspect of his poetry. This is a very simple poem, monochrome picture by Buson called The Raftsman, and it's got a text to the right, a prose preface, and it's got a haiku with it. It's just a sketch of a man who's on a simple raft, and he's wearing this traditional raincoat that would be made out of a kind of thatch, and wearing a simple rain hat, and he's pulling this raft down the river in a storm. This is the poem and the prose preface that goes with it. Arayashi yama no hana ni makari keru ni niwaka ni fu shikereba ikarashi no mino ya arashi no hanagoromo. When I went to the blossoms at Arashiyama, and suddenly the wind blew and rain fell, the straw raincoat of the raftsman is a robe of flowers in the storm. You can see that the poem matches the painting very well, and I think you can appreciate this unusual scene it presents. Buson is in Arashiyama, west of Kyoto, and he's viewing the sakura, the cherry blossoms that are in bloom. The river is close by, and all of a sudden this spring storm appears, scatters the blossoms, and he gets this vision of the humble raftsman who's elevated because the blossoms are swirling around him. He's wearing this robe of blossoms for a moment. It transforms this humble man into a glorious and a triumphant figure. This is another haiku by Buson. Shiraume ni akuru yo bakari to nari ni keri. Amid the white blossoms, the day is always breaking. And this, he gave it the topic of early spring. It's a beautiful image on its own. It's clearly set in early spring when the first flowers of the season, the plum blossoms, are blooming. And there are 2 major types, the red type and the white type. And this is the white type blooming. And I imagine it, the whole tree is in flower. Multiple trees are in flower. And the poet, the speaker, is below this canopy that is lit up, and it filters the sunlight or the moonlight, and it creates the illusion of the faint light of dawn, regardless of the time of day or night. We feel enveloped in the soft light and warmth of these blossoms. But like the poem by Basho that I showed you earlier about the bee and the peony, this one also has a known context. It's said to have been the last poem ever written by Buson, composed as he was dying, and in that way can be read as a summation of his work and his life. The final major poet of this triad is Kobayashi Issa. His dates are 1763 to 1828. He overlapped slightly, but not much, with Buson, and artistically went in totally the opposite direction. Issa embraced the everyday, the every man, every woman. He was married, he was a farmer, he lived in the province of Shinano, which is now Nagano Prefecture. He had money troubles. Here's his most famous poem, Yasegaeru makeru na Issa wa kore ni ari. Skinny frog, don't give up, Issa is here. We have another frog in Issa. This one is having a fight with another frog or some other animal, and Issa is ready to step in. on behalf of the underdog. This is perhaps his most famous poem. It shows a certain joie de vivre or bravado or concern for the downtrodden. Here's another one. Tsuyu no yo wa tsuyu no yo nagara sari nagara. The world of dew is a world of dew, and yet, be that as it may. This was written on the death of his young daughter from smallpox. World of dew is a stock Buddhist metaphor to describe the insubstantial and fragile nature of the world that we inhabit, this world that seems so great and enduring to us. In this poem, the speaker admits that he subscribes to this belief. He was, after all, a devout Buddhist. But the corollary is that we should abandon our attachments. However, giving up his fond and deep feelings for his departed daughter is asking too much of himself. While he accepts the teachings of Buddhism, he just can't bring himself to carry them out. Such is my inadequate survey of the representative works of the representative haiku poets of the classical tradition. And I'd like to turn now away from specific examples and turn toward more abstract musings about what haiku is, what it means, and what it does. A haiku, as we know, is probably the briefest verse form in the world, and it's no surprise that it comes from Japan, which has the shortest national anthem in the world, Kimi ga Yo. It's only 31 syllables long, and it's based on a tanka from the Kokinshu. And after all, isn't traditional Japanese culture well known for making something marvelous out of almost nothing? It's a kind of alchemy, elevating base metals into gold. That might be making a monochrome ink painting with nothing more than a piece of paper, some ink, some water, and a brush. Making a dry landscape garden out of gravel and rocks. Making a rustic style tea bowl out of a misshapen lump of clay, or a tea scoop just out of a piece of bamboo that you found somewhere. Or you might serve somebody a cup of tea and something sweet to eat with it, but it becomes the tea ceremony. And yet haiku are not miniatures. They're not something big that was shrunk down. They're also not fragments. They're not pieces of a larger whole. As we saw, the haiku originates in the hokku, the beginning verse of a linked verse sequence. Hokku were the beginning of something. They were a piece, but they were a piece of something that still didn't exist yet. And therein lies the suggestiveness and the incompleteness of haiku. They're designed to be incomplete because they were just beginning a sequence. Japan's worship of the imperfect, and that's a very apt and interesting phrase that appears in the Book of Tea by Okakura Tenshin, was first published in 1906 in English, not in Japanese, but in English. Japan's worship of the imperfect. Imperfect in the sense of flawed or cracked, yes, the misshapen tea bowl that changes hands in exchange for a small fortune, but also imperfect in the sense of the incomplete or the unfinished. The original haiku that were hokku were deliberately left unfinished so that the next poet had room to add a verse. They had to be read and be understood before they could be responded and replied to. Today, linked verse is nearly extinct, but we are still reading haiku. And it is the reader who completes the haiku, not the next poet in the session. A few years ago, I was once enamored of traditional Japanese woodworking, and I acquired a few traditional tools, including a plane, the kanna, so I could try to shave and smooth the wood and try to make these thin, impossibly thin, long ribbons of shavings. Of course, I didn't get very far because it's not enough to acquire a plane and to know how to use it properly, and I didn't know how to use it properly. You have to set up the plane. You have to fit the blade and the chip breaker into the slot, and you might actually have to enlarge the slot a little bit. Someone said you can't really buy a traditional Japanese plane. You can only buy a Japanese plane kit. Haiku to me seem a little bit similar. There's very little space. So in some cases, you are dependent upon knowing the context, but in others, all you have is 17 syllables and you have to complete it You have to figure it out for yourself. The great haiku poets I discussed today, Basho, Buson, and Issa, would not be very well known if they could still not be read and understood properly today. It's been said that great audiences are required for great actors to give great performances. The same can be said for readers and writers of literature. There are no poets without readers of poetry, readers who can read between the lines and extract a world from a few phrases. In a certain sense, haiku are the opposite of most literary forms, like the sonnet or the novel. They're easy to write, or easier to write than they are to read. This experience of reading haiku is one that I recommend to you highly. It forces us to adopt someone else's point of view for a minute or two while we try to sort out what are they getting at. They're not necessarily conveying a message to us. It's not necessarily decoding a code, but they might be drawing our attention to something, whether it be the feathers of a crow, the scent of a flower, the croak of a frog, or the color of the sky. Haiku teaches us to see, to smell, to listen, to sense, and to make sense of sensation, things we thought we knew how to do, but have to learn how to do all over again. Another of the things that I hope you take away from tonight is that haiku was originally a communal and a deeply social activity. I think we labor under this romantic idea that haiku is something that people write alone. We recollect it in the middle of some experience, this powerful emotion recollected in tranquility, as I said. And of course that happens. But the practice of Japanese poetry, haiku poetry in particular, has always been extremely social, whether it be the court poetry or the poetry contest or the actual collective composition of renga, which is the linked verse of haikai and by extension haiku. This social aspect was important not just in the production of haiku, but in its reception as well. It was because the haiku poets had read the same imperial anthologies of waka, which provided them with the linguistic and conceptual framework in which they wrote. They also knew the same great Chinese poets of antiquity, like Dufu and Su Shi, and they could pack these allusions into their poetry and have those allusions understood. They all dwelled in the same milieu, whether that be social, geographic, or artistic. Lightness. I mentioned Professor Makoto Ueda earlier in my remarks on Basho, and I have several fond memories of him, including this one. He was giving a seminar on haiku poetry, and I was taking it with a number of my graduate school classmates. One of them is here, Claire. I don't know if you were in this seminar or not. Maybe it was before your time. We all knew that Professor Ueda was a recognized expert on Basho, number one in the English-speaking world. And we were avidly trying to impress him and to show him that we had deep readings of Basho, and we were grasping the profundity of Basho. And there was nothing wrong with that, because Basho is one of the deepest poets that you're likely to encounter. There's a depth to his work, there's a sobriety, and sometimes even a gloom that hangs over his poetry. And there was one verse, and I wish I could recall what it was, but we were puzzling over it. We went from student to student and trying to attempt an interpretation of this verse. And Professor Ueda was testing us, and we were failing the test. It was clear. He said to us in the end, "Don't you see some kind of humor in this poetry, in this poem, some kind of lightness?" And indeed, lightness, there's a word for it, karumi. It just means lightness. It's part of haiku aesthetics. It's not just wabi and sabi, but there's room for play, for freedom, for a lack of attachments, and that's very important. I wrote in the abstract that for some people, haiku is a way of life, and I will leave it to the two haiku poets, Mitsuko and Scott, in a roundtable to talk about that point further, if they please. And I also mentioned wabi and sabi, and I feel like I should define them before somebody writes down on their card what is wabi and what is sabi. Wabi, to me, more or less means misery. Actually, etymologically, that's what it comes from, wabu, to be miserable. And it connotes someone living in reduced circumstances, the nouveau pauvre, if you will, but living with elegance and with grace. Sabi is homophonous with rust, and it connotes a patina of age, but it's linked to loneliness and desolation. Haiku didn't invent these terms, but it inherited them and celebrated them and embraced them to find beauty in what seems to be unremarkable, to see the nobility of everyday life and ordinary people, to seek joy in small moments. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that these are parts of the haikai imagination, and I propose that to you as my concluding thought. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We are now going to have a roundtable. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Bruce Rutledge. I'd also like to encourage you to begin jotting down your questions. You might have questions now, questions as the speakers speak. Bruce Rutledge founded Chin Music Press, an independent book publisher, in 2005. And since then, the press has published award-winning books about Japan and the experiences of Japanese Americans. The press also publishes Origami magazine. Bruce lived in Japan for 17 years. He worked for a series of news organizations, including Universal News Japan, Nihon Keizai Shimbun, NHK, and Japan Incorporated magazine. Thank you for being here, Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Atkins, for a really interesting lecture. We're going to dive into this conversation with our two poets. I'd like to introduce them first. To my far right is Scott Oakey. He's well known as a serial entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and a community activist. But you may not know that he's also a practitioner of haiku, tanka, and many other forms of poetry. He's published 6, I think, gorgeous volumes of haiku, just absolutely beautiful. And he's going to talk to us a little bit later about some of the other books that he's published. Immediately next to me is Mitsuko Miller. She has been writing haiku for over a decade with Rainier Ginsha. And Rainier Ginsha is a local haiku organization that started in 1932. They've been practicing for 90 years. 90 years of haiku chronicling life in the Pacific Northwest through the eyes of Japanese Americans. And she's going to introduce some of their work today as well. And just to reiterate what Professor Atkins said before we start the discussion, as you're listening to these poets and you have those index cards, if you have any questions that you want to ask them, or maybe something from Professor Atkins' lecture that springs to mind now, write the question on your card and pass it this way to my left, and our volunteers will pick them up and deliver them to me to facilitate the conversation. So first, let's turn to Ms. Miller. You're going to show us some of the haiku from Rainier Ginsha?
Yes.
Great.
Some few, but I start something else first.
Sure, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Bruce. I joined Rainier Ginsha 10 years ago, and one of my best experiences has been learning about the history of Japanese Americans through haiku. I'm talking about the haiku, which were created by Japanese people in internment camps during World War II. I would like to introduce a few of them. The first one is Yamabyobu, kaze megurashite ite niju saku. Byobu, the Yamabyobu, byobu means screen or background. And this camp was surrounded by mountains. People were behind the barbed wire with the guard towers. They were double fenced. This is an expression showing that they could never escape. 苦しさも心構えで就業所。隔離所で希望を抱いて待つ平和。Both hikes are showing the people's attitude and the ways of living in internment camps, carrying through painful experiences with hope. You can tell how these people lived on a day-to-day basis in detail when you read their haiku. For example, they organized the hike clubs, baseball teams in the camp, planted vegetable gardens to cover food supply shortages, etc. I'm not bringing up any sad hike today, but some of their hikes brought tears to my eyes. For example, a mother's sorrow when one son joined American military and then the other one joined Japanese. Apparently, separation of families was very common in those times. Turi Lake was one of the 10 internment camps that were built in remote desert area in 6 states. Most of the internees they were labeled disloyal to United States simply because of their non-resident alien status. They were treated as enemy aliens despite personal conflict and emotional traumas which created animosity. We can find many hikes which show the strength of people coping with their hardship. I was so grateful to learn about this part of the history in depth through haiku. 10 years ago, I thought the haiku was an old person's hobby. Keeping it as just a hobby is okay. Nothing is wrong there. But the more you compose haiku, the more haiku becomes part of your life. And you start paying attention to things around you. Small things like a morning dew on the spider web or potato flower. How many people knows what the potato flower looks like? It's a tiny white flower, square shaped, and the yellow dot in the center of the flower, and the edge of the petal is a slight purple. You will notice that there are so many beautiful things around you. The next one is my haiku. 移り住む国の民として花火や The English version, I put it there. And this was made on the July 4th, the year I received the US citizenship. The hanabi is a small children's sparkler, which they play with and entertain themselves on summer night on their backyards. This is my little celebration. Haiku is not a poem about only flowers or singing birds. You can express your life. Rainier Ginsha is traditional hike. Therefore, we have a lot of rules. One is called Kigo. Professor Atkins mentioned that. Now, I forgot to bring it today, but we have this big, heavy dictionary we call Saijiki, and we have a lot of kigos in there. And we have to memorize all of them. I'm just kidding. We just carry the little handbook. And in this case, hanabi is the kigo and sama kigo. And anyway, all the words are separated by the 4 seasons and then New Year's. Haiku is a very short poem, therefore the word you choose has a very important role conveying good communication and echoing good taste. Next, I would like to show you a shashin haiku, which is photo haiku. Shashin haiku, of course, started after photo cameras were invented. Before that time, there were haiku. Professor Atkins showed a little bit, but for example, but here is the Duson's haiku. 岩倉の共助恋せよホトトギス boson. And the picture of hydrangea and cuckoos are haiga. And this is the boson's original. And the Iwakura is a name of the place that people believed in those days that this waterfall would cure madness. Loud and noisy cuckoo sounds remind me of a mad woman's scream in failed love. That's the meaning of a haiku. And then you look at the hydrangea colors change throughout the season, similar to lover's mind. Indeed, we can imagine all kinds of possibilities in only short 17 syllable of haiku. Next one, I show you the Shashin haiku. This is Mr. Koike Banjin. Koike Banjin was a Rainier Ginsha's founder about 90 years ago. And also he was a photographer and quite well known in those days. The photo was Dr. Koike's, but the message is here is not his. This Shashin haiku was mailed to him. And I tried to find at the university, Washington's library, but there are a lot of collection of his photos. Yeah, but unfortunately, I couldn't find the picture and then haiku was together. But you can get the idea of the greeting card here. And when you read the haiku, you can imagine its background. You will see the picture or vice versa. And that's one of the fun things you can do when you do haiku. Next one, please. The first one, this is done by the late Dr. Kyoko Tokuno's. Photo is, of course, it's at the University of Washington campus. Kanoma no Senyoka no Saki Doko Saki Doko e. But she saw this cherry blossoms and then she imagined this wonderland here now, but what lies ahead? She's thinking about already flower was coming down and then she was thinking about different things, but depends on the person, and you can imagine all kinds of different things. And but anyway, that's what her picture. And next one is mine. What I don't know how much you. Yoko ni moyuru keikoku hiro shite. Hiro is a different Japanese, it's red, means red. Akai is red, but there's another word for he in Japanese in hiro. There's a different, that's the fun part of Japanese. It's the same thing, but we express a different way. And there's so many of them like that. So that was a really interesting thing to do for me. So anyway, the English version of that is on the top. And next one, please. This one is the Hisao is the president of Rainier Ginsha. That's his picture, and the previous picture is also his picture too. And then This is 夏霞画家の愛せし大渓谷、大峡谷。Then English was done up there, and I think this is a picture of somewhere in Arizona. But anyway, I hope that I could demonstrate that haiku is not just a poem. It is a way of looking at the words and the way of life, learning how to live and enjoy life at the same time. It does not require a college degree or any higher level of education, and elementary school kids can do it too. And it's a good brain exercise, and it does not cost any money. Just enjoy using the beautiful Japanese language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. The images you brought to life, the morning dew on the spider web and things like that, that was lovely. Let's turn to Scott. Excuse me, Scott. You've written over 2,500 haiku. You're inspired by Basho, I believe, but you're going to tell us a little bit about your whole writing career first so we can get a feel for the writer, Scott Oki. Yes.
All English. It's now on. And that was a book that I wrote to basically discuss what was wrong with our public K-12 education system. I wish I could tell you that things have improved, but they haven't. You know, it's weird. The most powerful country in the world, you know, Finland has the #1 public school education system. Where do you think the United States ranks? 25. It's unbelievable. Okay, poetry. The first book of haiku I wrote was titled Life, Love, Happiness. That was in 2016. That was a book of 150 haiku. The second was Past, Present, Future, another 150 haiku. The third was Look Deep Inside, another 150 haiku. And the last was a final chapter. You'll notice the question mark, because I didn't know if I was going to write more haiku. I turned my attention to writing more traditional poetry. So the first thing I wrote was a book of prose. It's called Musings. That was published in 2021. The next book was called Contemplations. This is free verse poetry with intertwined rhyme. That was published this year. Also this year, I published another book of haiku that was titled Nirvana. This was a tabletop book comprised of 225 haiku with hand calligraphy, just beautifully done. The next book, next slide. Next book has not been published yet. Actually, everything on this slide hasn't been published. All the poetry has been written. It needs to be designed, you know, needs to go to the printer, needs to be laid out. So the first one is Wander and Wonder. This is a book of lyrical poetry. Then there's Satori, which is a 4-volume tabletop book of haiku. And then On My Honor, which is my memoir. Explorations, which is free verse with intertwined rhyme. Shibui, which is tanka poetry. And then Chisana, which is haiku poetry. And then finally Tidbits, which will be comprised of many different forms of poetry, including limericks. While many of these books comprise what I refer to as the cairn series. Now, those of you who know cairns, they're like stones stacked atop one another. They designate a trail to be followed. And so very similarly, these books are different sizes. They get smaller and smaller. And they're going to be, I'm actually going to be having someone create a wooden base for these 7 or 8 books that will be in the shape of kind of a tori. So if you can think of a gate that, before a temple, just the very top part. So the kind of like that, and the books will be stacked on that, on top of them. Next slide, please. So this is, oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, so this is a photograph of the 4 volumes, the very first volumes of haiku that I wrote. It is a bookshelf series of haiku. Okay, next. Okay, this one is a Nirvana. So you can see the artwork that is associated with it. All of the poetry also has been translated into Japanese, which is very difficult. Fortunately, we have a great team here in the United States, plus we have a great team in Japan. So I'm pretty sure it's fairly accurate. I wouldn't know because I only speak English. Next slide. This is a kind of a photograph of a page of Satori. Okay, it's a tabletop book, opens up. You'll notice the big character here, the calligraphy. I did that. I'm actually quite proud of it. So throughout Satori, you will see various kanji characters that I have done the calligraphy for, using a big brush, black ink, and doing it time after time after time until I got all the brush strokes absolutely correctly, right order, right pressure. I mean, it is insanely difficult, but mission accomplished. Next slide. Okay, this is just an example of a tanka poem that I wrote. Let your mind wander, ponder things that seem crazy, explore alleyways, stop and look closely at life. A smile might lead to hot tea. Next slide. Another tanka poem. A powerful heart, pumping fluid like the sea, ebbing and flowing, bring far-reaching nutrients. Do not ever stop beating. So I've written, I don't know, I've already written 150 tanka poems that will go into my book of tanka poems. I'll probably continue writing all different kinds of forms of poetry, but this will give you a flavor for kind of what keeps me busy and out of trouble during the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Scott, where can we see these beautiful books?
Well, interestingly, there's only one that you can purchase on like Amazon. That's the very first book I wrote, Outrageous Learning. The rest, actually, I have used as omiyage. So I give them out as gifts. In the case of Nirvana, I donated like 50 copies of Nirvana to Densho to basically help raise money. So, and they went out to their donor base, and anyone who wanted to make a donation of $1,000 would get a copy of Nirvana, and that $1,000 would also be matched by someone, another donor, who made a contribution of $50,000. Since then, we've decided to actually make some of the poetry available on our website. So it's called info@o-kaisha.com. O-kaisha is the name of my family company. So you can go there. And honestly, I'm not in the business to really sell these things. You know, I would make the statement right now that I would, you know, the intention is to donate 100%, not the profits, 100% of the revenues to various charities.
Thank you. We have some questions from the audience that I'd like to jump into. I think this one may be probably for Professor Atkins and Ms. Miller. For haiku written in Japanese in the 5-7-5 pattern, does it matter that the English translation doesn't fit the 5-7-5?
In my experience translating tanka, 31 syllables into English, they typically average out about 28 syllables in English. And if you know one thing about poets, it's they don't like to pad their lines and add words that don't belong there, especially haiku poets or tanka poets. I haven't done a similar syllabic count for haiku, but I imagine that it might come in under 17 in some cases. So for me personally, I would say when I translate the haiku up there, I try to give something that's short, followed by something that's long, followed by something that's short, but I don't hew too closely to the syllabic count. And as we saw with Basho, I mean, he did that one with the peonies, 885. I don't, really know what he was going. It's more of a guideline than a rule for him at that point.
Thank you. Ms. Miller, do you anything to add there or on translation or no?
It's really difficult to translate in English, and then the English version has to be like a poem too. So just to explain what's in the for example, I did the Buson's haiku, and I just explained the meaning of the haiku in English, but that's not the actual. So I mean, doing it Japanese haiku, I don't quite understand the English haiku part of the, I mean, shorter than the normal poem, or I don't know what, maybe he can explain better, I don't know.
Well, actually, Scott, we have a question for you. Do you have a plan to visit Basho's walking trails?
Only if someone's carrying me. It's probably something that that I would love to do. Actually, my wife Lori is in the audience, and one of the things that we've been toying with is what we are going to do next year to celebrate my 75th birthday. And the idea right now is to go to Japan and to go on just a nice trip to see a lot of different things, and maybe Basho's Trail might be one. I haven't had an opportunity to recite any of the haiku poems that the 2,500 or however many haiku that I've written, but I did go through some of the haiku, and I sorted out some of my favorites. Technically, I'm not sure if it's haiku or senryu. Maybe it's a combination of both. But this one is a funny one. We mentioned geese, and that is kind of there's a word right associated with akigo. So it goes like this, right? Geese are not all that bad. Lovely that they mate for life. Just stop the pooping. And then there's another one that actually is one of my favorite. It goes like this: Blankies for big, small, warmth and comfort, what a joy. Nanny and Webster. Now, most people won't know, what's he talking about? Well, Nanny and Webster is the name of a baby blanket company that my wife and I started 31 years ago. And the blankets are sold to companies like Microsoft to give to their employees who have newborns. And 100% of the profits, very similar to what Paul Newman does with Paul Newman's Own, 100% of the profits goes to children's charities. Well, Nanny and Webster is the name of that baby blanket company. Nanny being the name of the giraffe that our first son always carried around with him by its neck, so that finally you stand them down and the neck would just flop over. And Webster was the name of, Lori, help me out here. Oh, yeah, anyways, another gift. Anyways, that's Nanny and Webster, and that's the reference, and that's why it brings so much joy in many ways than just bringing warmth and comfort.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. I think this is probably for all three of you. What sparked the interest in haiku to people outside of Japan? Anyone want to take it?
Well, yeah, you know, I kind of reflected way back. My very first haiku that I ever wrote was as a 7-year-old in first grade at Bailey Gatzert Elementary School in the inner city of Seattle. Mrs. Claire Suguro was my teacher. And one day she said, okay, class, we're gonna learn how to write haiku. And so we did. And about, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, I was kind of in the process of writing my memoir, and I kind of hit the wall. I don't know, I just couldn't get any further. And yet I had this desire to continue to write. And I said, why not write haiku? So I started writing haiku. It became almost a daily ritual, almost meditative. And, you know, there are times when I would just have a thought. I just jot it down, well, in my iPhone. And I'd come back to it a day, 2 days later, refine it a little bit. Still not done, you know, come back a week later, find the right words, find the right, you know, feeling. And finally, you know, you end up with a haiku. And even at that, oftentimes, you know, I think it's 5, 7, 5 syllables, but how many syllables is every? I always used to thought it was 3 syllables, every, but it's 2. And so, you know, I'd have to go through my poetry and actually edit it to make sure that there were the right number of syllables. Even though Basho wasn't that strict about, you know, syllable count, I tended to be. So yeah, pretty manic about that.
Professor Atkins, how about you? Any reason that it spread so far and wide? This
I come to
little
the
form
study
from Japan?
of haiku through waka poetry. As we saw with Scott's verse up here, the tanka, it's 31 syllables. There's a lot more room to it. They're much more prestigious than haiku because they come out of the court tradition, the aristocratic court tradition. And I was kind of, I think, inherited that little snobbery. I thought, well, haikai aren't such a big deal. I can handle haikai, I can handle waka, and they are a big deal. And they're very difficult because they're so brief and they're so compressed and they're hard. Normally, we consume these haiku through an annotated edition, whether it be in Japanese or in English. You've got the notes. In English, you have a translation, you have the explanation. But if you try to read them just raw, the way they are, they're very, very difficult. And I have an increased respect for them. I was going to show you the same picture that Mitsuko showed you with the hydrangea and the madwoman, and as an idea of a picture by Poussin. I couldn't understand that poem. It just didn't make sense to me. And your explanation made a lot of sense to me. So I wouldn't be fooled by these haiku. They are deceptively simple. They're not so simple as they seem to be. And I think that's really amazing.
We have one more question from the audience, probably for Professor Atkins. Is haiku a Zen art? Why or why not? With a follow-up, did R.H. Blythe and the Beat Poets over Zen haiku?
That's a good question. I looked at some of R.H. Blythe's works. R.H. Blythe was an Englishman. He was imprisoned or interned by the Japanese during the war. He had excellent command of the language, and he almost had this mystical, spiritual approach to haiku. He has at least 4 volumes about haiku in different seasons. And for something written in that period, I think he published it just in the immediate post-war period, 1950s or so. It was really quite amazing. I was struck by how he emphasized the spiritual side. And of course, spiritual part leads to Zen, which is really embraced and adored by Americans in particular, Westerners in general, because it's so different from, I think, most Western religions, especially Christianity, but especially Americans. We love this spontaneity and this naturalness. And so whether it's been overdone or not, it's hard for me to say. I typically cling to the Japanese scholarship, and it's there. It's certainly there. Basho was writing after the heyday of Zen in Japan, and Zen was important to him. That immediacy, you saw that in the haiku poem, the frog poem. If you want to read that as a Zen poem, nobody can stop you. But I wouldn't call it necessarily a Zen art. I think anything could be a Zen art if you took a Zen approach to it. And if you didn't, then maybe it isn't. It's something else. It could be something else as well. So I think I could go either way with that one.
Thank you. All right. We have another question from the audience, and I'm gonna add on to this because I have a question for Ms. Miller. The question is, do you connect with other haiku writers? And I was interested in hearing about Rainier Ginsha. How is it? If you could talk to us a little bit about, do you have monthly meetings? Do you get together? That kind of thing, because it seems like that's a place where writers are connecting. 90 years.
Okay. We meet once a month, every first Saturday, and it starts about 12:30, and then ends probably 4 o'clock-ish. Basically, we brought all the members makes 5 haiku every month. It has to include 1 kigo. So you can make 1 haiku with a kigo, and the other 4 doesn't include a kigo, that's okay. Or you can make all 5 haiku with the same kigo. You can do that way too. So because we are in traditional style, and the modern haiku doesn't have to include the kigo or any of those rules, but in order to practice the traditional way, we are kind of forced to use the kigo. And how to, basically when you use kigo, you have to understand what's the background of the meaning of this kigo and all those things. And then that has to reflect on each haiku. And, if we get into the rules and stuff, then it's going to be, you need another class. But anyway, it's kind of interesting thing. It's kind of eye-opening even between the Japanese people. And we brought the 5 haiku each, and without put the names on the haiku. So if you have 20 people in the class, then we have to read 100 haikus without knowing who made this haiku. Then they pick about 10 haiku you think it's best. Then we count as who got the most points. So that's what we could do. And then we talked after that, and we talked to each other and then help each other, and that kind of basically conversation. And it's kind of fun things to do, that part. So there is a one time I think he's UW students joined here. He was a Caucasian male, and he tried to use haiku in Japanese in our class. That's what he did. And, you know, I mean, it just like a children's haiku he made, but so cute and, you know, was interesting too. So we enjoy that too, but he didn't continue. But I thought that if there is a student is trying to learn the Japanese language, I think this haiku has a 5 syllables. There is a rhythm. A lot of Japanese language has the same rhythm everywhere, even though the present TV commercials, if you pay attention, it's all 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, those syllables. And so maybe it's a good idea to, you know, learn the Japanese or memorize it with the rhythm. It's a good idea. I don't know. What do you think?
Thank you, Ms. Miller. That's good to hear that the social aspect of haiku is alive and well at Rainier Ginsha. We're about out of time. I have one last question. I think maybe Professor Atkins or maybe Ms. Miller can answer this. Can modern Japanese still read the old poems?
I'm not a modern Japanese person, so I don't know. I'm sorry to say.
Well, definitely there was an impression, even in Japanese people, haiku is old stuff, you know, like a basho, everybody knows basho and buson, so, okay, old culture, that's the way we felt. So now I mean, but I thought the same way. And when you, at the first, when you want to make a haiku, trying to make something sounds old, or, you know, and no, you don't. You have to make a haiku the period you live, and you have to reflect the world you live in. And so it doesn't have to be old style, but you know, but old Japanese language has a really beautiful sound. Sometimes we mix them together, but definitely current modern language can be used in haiku.
I want to thank our panelists, Professor Atkins, Scott Oki, Mitsuko Miller. I believe Yumi Osaka is going to have a few last words.
So thank you again so much to all the panelists. And I would also like to thank everybody here in Kane Hall and online for joining us. For today's event, we had publicity and communications help from many area organizations, which are listed on the screen and on the program. And we are very grateful to each one of them for their assistance. And special thanks to Russ Hugo of UW's Language Learning Center and Anna Schnell of the Department of Asian Languages and Literature for providing all the technical and administrative support to make this event possible. If you enjoyed today's event, or if you're inspired to start writing your own haiku, or if you'd like to see more events like this one, please consider making a donation to UW's Washinkai Fund. Community support is vital for Washinkai to continue to offer events like this for free, and we would really appreciate donations of any amount. There's a QR code on the screen and on the program to make giving easy. Now, the next Washinkai event will be on April 19th next year. We are very excited to have Professor Ken Oshima of UW's Department of Architecture to give a talk on the world-famous Katsura Rikyu. The lecture will be titled Visions of Katsura Imperial Villa as a Paradigm of Japanese Arts and Cultures. I hope you will join us again in April for this exciting foray into classical Japanese architecture. So this concludes the program, and thank you so much for attending. And please join us in Walker Ames room across the hall for some refreshments and a chance to chat. Thank you, and good night.